This is the story of starting with one small idea, having one thing lead to another, and having it turn into a full-blown auto-running simulated basketball league. Over the last 3 years, I turned K-pop idols into basketball players, multiplied 2 teams into over 20, simulated 5 seasons and counting, and added an interactive portion for fantasy basketball and trading card game enthusiasts. How did this happen? The year is 2018 September. I had just returned from a semester of studying abroad in South Korea, but I was lonely, bored, and curious about K-pop, so one day I decided to just go for it. I tried to remember the most popular girl groups at the time when I studied in Korea: Twice, Red Velvet, and Blackpink. I gravitated toward Twice the most. People said that my interest in K-pop would just be a phase, but 5 months later, in February of 2019, I was still very much into K-pop. That was when I remember reading a comment on Reddit. I could never find that comment again, but it was what started it all. The commenter suggested how cool it would be to see a 9-on-9 basketball game, where Twice, with 9 members, was one team, and Red Velvet, 5 members, and Blackpink, 4 members, combined to be the other team. I remember thinking, that's a great idea. Let me try to see if I can code that. Basketball is a 5-on-5 game played against 2 teams. Other players are on the bench and can substitute into the game if needed. In professional basketball, the 5 players on the court usually each take one of 5 positions. From shortest to tallest, they are the point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, and center. The point guard usually starts the offense, and the center is usually positioned near the basket. I say usually because nowadays positions are interchangeable in professional basketball, but each player is still officially labeled a position. Why does all this matter? Well, I had to think about how I was going to translate the characteristics of a K-pop idol into a basketball player. The easiest way to go was to make the shortest idols point guards, the tallest idols centers, and everyone else some position in between. There's only one problem. I felt that there wasn't enough variation in height, so I took a more interesting approach. Instead of using height for position, I went with standing reach. Standing reach is the height when a person puts their arms straight up. I would measure standing reach by taking into account a player's height and wingspan. Wingspan is the length when a person fully spreads their arms out. But how do I measure an idol's wingspan? Heights are publicly available information, but wingspan? Who really cares besides me? There was a time when I actually tried to measure each idol's wingspan, but quickly realized that it was way too much work, so I scrapped the idea. What now? Well, my final idea was to make a publicly available statistic for idols and somehow use that as a kind of wingspan length, even if it was inaccurate in real life. And this makes no sense, but I went with blood type. Yes, blood type. You see, in Asian culture, people are obsessed with knowing their blood type, so idols' blood types are actually publicly available information. Now, how in the world would blood type translate into wingspan? Well, there are basically 4 blood types: A, B, AB, and O. I assigned each of them a multiplier value: 1.03 for O, 1.06 for A, 1.09 for B, and 1.12 for AB. So each idol has a multiplier, and I would use this to multiply their height to get their wingspan. Let's take Red Velvet's Irene as an example. Irene is 5'3" and has a blood type of A. So here, her wingspan would be 5'7". It doesn't matter if that's her real wingspan. I just wanted a number for each idol for reference. The reason why I use the numbers 1.03 through 1.12 as multipliers is that in almost all cases, your wingspan length is greater than your height, but wingspan ratios can differ by person. Once I had a wingspan number for each idol, I took 80% of an idol's height, 40% of an idol's wingspan, and then added them together to get an idol's standing reach. Is it their actual standing reach? No. The standing reach gave me enough of a variation that I could create a scale to place idols into 9 different levels. Each idol would get assigned a number from 1 to 9 depending on the idol's standing reach, and each number represents a position. Technically, only 5 positions exist, but nowadays most basketball players are labeled 2 overlapping positions. So those idols assigned 1 are pure point guards, 2 and 3 are point guard shooting guards, 4 and 5 are shooting guard small forwards, 6 are small forward power forwards, 7 and 8 are power forward centers, and 9 are pure centers. And there we have it, positions for every player. But we're just getting started. Now, I had to think about what kind of basketball skills each idol would have. I didn't want it to be completely random. There had to be something in real life that could be taken and translated into basketball stardom. For basketball skills, I settled with 4 main skills: athleticism, basketball IQ, shooting, and defense. More skills exist in basketball, of course, but I decided that every other skill in basketball would become a combination of any of these 4 skills along with standing reach and wingspan in different ratios. For example, an idle skill for blocking shots was determined 50% by their wingspan and 50% by their defense. I tried to be as logical as I could for these abilities, but admittedly, some of these are nonsensical. Still, I just needed numbers and calculations for reference. Now the question became, how do I determine athleticism, basketball IQ, shooting, and defense for each idol? That was when I realized, oh wait, idols have skills in real life too. They can sing, they can dance, and some of them can rap. Why not use those skills and translate them into basketball? So I did. An idol's dance ability translated into athleticism in basketball, vocal ability translated into shooting, and rap ability translated into basketball IQ. I was thinking about coming up with a 4th real-life ability for defense, but then I felt bad for idols who may not be that skilled in any of vocal, dance, or rap compared to their peers, so I left defensive skill in basketball as a leftover ability, meaning, if your vocal, dance, and rap abilities aren't good, at least your defense is. So every idol is skilled or at least average in something in basketball. How did I rate an idol's vocal, dance, or rap ability? I assigned a number from 1 to 9 for each of the 3 abilities to each idol and compared them against the members of their group. Since I combined Red Velvet and Blackpink into one group, they became a combined group known as Black Velvet. To determine what number each idol would get for an ability, I did some research. I took videos which ranked idols in a group for each ability, averaged them out, and assigned numbers accordingly. And just like that, we turned K-pop idols into basketball players, each with their own abilities. Now I have to think about how to simulate a realistic basketball game. Basketball games are just a series of plays. This is how I thought of it. It starts with a tip-off at the center of the court, where there's a 50% chance that a team would get possession of the ball. Once the tip-off is done, the point guard of the team with the ball brings the ball up to the court to just about the 3-point line. Then, the point guard who has the ball can make one of 3 decisions. Should they A. Shoot the ball, B. Pass the ball to a teammate, or C. Drive to the rim. Each player is assigned a probability for each decision, and their probabilities depend on their skills. A better shooter may be more inclined to shoot the ball, or a better passer may be more inclined to pass. Either way, a probability is calculated and a decision is made. If the player passes, then the decision making starts all over again, with the new decision maker being the player that has the ball after the pass. If the player instead shoots the ball, then they either make the shot, which results in 2 or 3 points, or they miss the shot. If they miss the shot, somebody will get the rebound and obtain possession of the ball. An offensive rebound is when one of your teammates rebound the ball, while a defensive rebound is when one of your opponents rebound the ball. Then, after the rebound, the decision making starts all over again with the rebounder, although if it is a defensive rebound, then the ball is brought up to the other side of the court. Better rebounders have a higher chance of getting the rebound. Now let's look at the third option. If the player attempts to drive to the rim with the ball, either the player is successful or not successful. If successful, they are now at the rim and start the decision-making process again, in which case they can pass, shoot, or take the ball outside the 3-point line again. If unsuccessful, they either stay where they are or perhaps they were able to get a little closer within the 3-point line. Success in driving to the rim is calculated as a probability based on both the driving skill of the player with the ball and the defensive skill of the defender. Those are the basics to how this basketball algorithm works, but there is a hidden 4th option that some players have. Some players can post up, which means to back down the defender to the rim. If successful, they are now at the rim for decision making. There are also probabilities, albeit small, of a defender stealing the ball from a player, or the player making a bad pass out of bounds, which would give possession to the ball to the other team, or a defender blocking a shot attempt of a player, among other things, which adds some spice to the algorithm. A full 48-minute game is just a series of decisions, just thousands of them. In each step, the algorithm calculates the probabilities, makes a decision based on those probabilities, and the process repeats until the time runs out. When it does, the team with more points is the winner, or if the score is tied, a 5-minute overtime period is held. And that's basically how I came up with an algorithm that could simulate a realistic 48-minute basketball game. With the push of a button, I could simulate a different game every time, and I loved it. I had a friend who was also interested in both K-pop and basketball, and we were hanging out around the time I finished this algorithm. I would read the play-by-play to him as if it were a bedtime story, and we both had a lot of fun imagining these idols making these basketball plays. What if I could take this a step further? What if instead of 2 teams, I had 20 teams? So I did. Something to note though is the different sizes of these groups. Groups in K-pop usually have anywhere between 4 and 13 members, but I concluded that the ideal number of players a team should have in my league is between 7 and 9. A 7-player team meant that each player would play an average of 34 minutes a game, and a 9-player team meant that each player would play an average of 27 minutes a game, both realistic numbers. So if a real-life K-pop group had anywhere between 7 and 9 members, I assigned them as a team of their own. If a group had more than 9 members, then I would move some members into groups that had 6 or less members and form a new team with them. Sometimes I would combine a 4-member group with a 5-member group and make that a team, like I did with Black Velvet. As for the groups themselves, I just tried to research what the most popular groups at the time were. These are the groups I came up with. With the 20-team league that I now had, and 10 teams in each conference, the G Conference and the B Conference, I could create and simulate entire seasons, much like the NBA does. Each season, a team would play 82 regular season games. Each team would play every other team at least once that season. I wrote an algorithm that could generate a season schedule. Then, after all teams played 82 games, the top 8 teams from each conference would make the playoffs, and each would match up against another team and play a best-of-7 series. Winners of each series would advance, and this would repeat until there was only one team left standing, and that team would be crowned as champions for that season. I would set this up so that every day at 7 p.m. Eastern, the games for that day would automatically play, and each game would only take about 10 minutes to run. Normal basketball teams take over 2 hours to play with commercials, so I like this a lot better. Sometimes I would be busy, but that's fine. The games would still run, and I could tune in if I wanted. I now had an auto-running basketball league. But wait, what if I could take this a step further? A regular season is 82 games long for a team, and playoffs might take 2 months to play. But there was no need to stretch this out in 1 year. These are imaginary basketball players after all, and they'll never get tired or injured, unlike real life. Since I don't have to space out games to allow for recovery, there was plenty of space to simulate the 2 seasons in 1 year. So I did that. But I didn't make the 2 seasons in 1 year the exact same thing. I essentially made 2 different leagues, but both consisting of the same players. The first league I called the Standard League, where the players are mostly in teams resembling the real-life groups. I would call the teams according to their real-life group names with a few variations like Black Velvet, so you could say this league is pretty standard. But for the other league, I mixed the players and teams up, and I called it the Mixed League. I started out with a draft that kind of randomly put players into teams, and for each team name, I would use one of the group's song titles. I also gave each player a random contract to start with, which would indicate the amount of money and the period of time a player is signing with a team, much like how it works in the NBA. After every season, if a player's contract expired, they would either re-sign a new contract with their team or sign a new contract with another team. A player's new contract length and money depended upon how good the player was that previous season statistically and how much demand there was for the player with other teams. Better stats and more demand for the player meant a more lucrative contract. So now you could have storylines of players leaving teams to join other ones, and boy did that make things infinitely more fun. But that's not all. Every year I decided to add 2 more new teams into the league. In the Standard League, I would simply just add the teams, 1 to each conference, but in the Mixed League, I would make 2 expansion teams. If you don't know how an expansion team works, basically a new team is made, and that team now needs players. All the other teams can protect a certain number of players on their teams so they can't get selected to be part of the expansion team. In the NBA, that number is 8, but to make things spicy here, teams in this league could only protect their best 5 players. Then the expansion team could choose from the pool of unprotected players to form their own team. But wait, that's not it. After the expansion draft, another draft is held where the players in the 2 new teams added in the Standard League are to be selected by teams of the Mixed League. Much like the NBA, the worst teams in the previous year generally tend to get the highest draft picks, where they could select a player to add to their team. And, just to spice things up, each player's skill levels would change slightly after every season. With this kind of randomization, after a few seasons, we could see some statistical superstars. It would be fun to see if those superstars are able to carry their teams to championships. Just like that, we have 2 auto-running leagues in 1 year. Up until this point, I was doing everything offline. It had been a year since I started this project. I would press run, my code would run, and hundreds of thousands of lines of code would spit out, simulating entire seasons. I thought it was finally time to bring this project online. I had some coding background from before, but I had no idea how to convert the thousands of lines of code I wrote in Python into a website. I did some research, and after months of trying to get this to work, I used a Python run program called Flask, which connected the backend, the code I wrote, to the front end, web pages that people could see, as well as a database which I used to store stats. It actually worked perfectly. Sure, I have zero artistic ability, but I was ready to get this project called Kpopbasketball into the world. I even started simulating my very first season of the Standard League in July of 2020. Surely there had to be people interested in what I was doing, right? I felt that there would be enough of an overlap in K-pop fans and basketball enthusiasts that an audience would exist. I started out with Reddit ads because after all, this all started with a Reddit comment. I had a few positive comments, but the most upvoted comments in the ad were negative, calling my project cringe. They probably have a point, but man, was I heartbroken. I had no results after 3 days, so I stopped the ad. I had failed to gain any success my first time out there, and I wasn't sure what to do next. Looking back on my site, I realized that there wasn't really any kind of interaction that a site user could do. Also, at the time, I didn't have a landing page. If a new user stumbled upon my site, they would have no idea what my site would be about. The solution to this was easy. Just create a landing page. But what about the user interaction part? Well, I decided to come up with fantasy basketball, but for my league. In case you didn't know, fantasy sports is a billion-dollar industry. Surely it would be familiar to some people at least. Though for my case, it would work a little differently than how fantasy sports normally work. Usually in fantasy sports, you form a league amongst your friends and you divide up the players with your friends through a fantasy draft. In my case though, you could choose any 5 players you wanted, just one for each position. That way, a user could choose the ideal team that they want. The players in your fantasy team would accumulate stats based on the games that they played, and you would accumulate points which translated into earning tokens. So the better your players do statistically, the more tokens you collect. I then had to figure out what users could do with these tokens. First, I allowed users to give tokens to players. The more tokens a player had in relation to their teammates, the more minutes, playing time, they would get in games, on average. But I felt that this wasn't enough. What if, after every season, a player card was released for each player, which showed their stats for that season? It would be similar to baseball cards, except it was digital, and only one copy of a player from a certain season existed. You could use the tokens you earned from your fantasy team to buy these cards. Sure, they are collector's items, but they could be way more than that. Also, maybe some users didn't have the patience to accumulate tokens through their fantasy team, but really wanted a certain player card. Okay, then I guess I can make some player cards available to buy with actual money. But to prevent the best player cards from being gobbled up by users that have money, I made the best player cards available with tokens only. Now what if I made these player cards transferable, tradable, or even resellable? As long as someone was willing to buy, users could essentially buy the player cards with tokens and resell them later and make actual money. I actually tried to re-release my project based on this concept. It failed miserably, but that is a video for another day. But I do have another idea. As I said before, I think this player card concept could go way beyond just being collector's items. What if, using the player cards you collected, you could form essentially your own team with them, and you could battle other users' teams with your team? After all, I did spend years writing an algorithm to simulate basketball games. I could use that same algorithm for playing basketball games between 2 users' card teams. Then, you could download a copy of the game you simulated if you wanted. But wait, if I use the rule that every team had to have between 7 and 9 players for minutes distribution purposes, by that same logic, does that mean that every user needs to have at least 7 player cards to even attempt to battle other users? Not necessarily. It would be kind of mean to require that. So instead, I made it possible to battle others even if you own just 1 player card. When you buy your first player card, you get a playset of 9 trainees for free, which are basically like placeholder cards that you can use for your card team. These trainee player card stats are adjustable, but you can only max out their stats to a limited extent. That way, if you own just 1 actual player card, you can still add 6 trainees to your team to fulfill the minimum 7 card player requirement. So now I've created a whole section where you can search for other users and battle their card teams with your own. I've essentially turned this into a trading card game, and that's kind of where I am at now. But I would like to do one more thing. You know, if you've made it this far into the video, I applaud you. I didn't think there would be anyone interested enough to sit through all of this, but here we are. I have to be honest with you, the real reason why I created this YouTube channel was because I needed users for my site, and I thought the YouTube algorithm would be the best way to find those users. So this channel really is one great experiment of whether I can attract the right people who are interested in the project I'm working on. If this fails, then I'm not sure what else to do. But the reason why I mention this is that whatever I want to do next involves actual users or even a community of interested people. I think a minimum of 16 users who own at least one player card would be all I need to get started. But imagine, with these users' player card teams, I hold weekly tournaments, simulate some rounds, and at the end of it, the winner gets a monetary prize, which can be based on a portion of the revenue of card sales. As more users join and buy player cards, the prize pool can get bigger. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty hyped about this. I do believe that this is my final step for K-pop basketball. So we've basically come to the end of the video here. If this is a vision you'd love to contribute to, how about starting with creating a lineup and accumulating tokens, or even joining the K-pop basketball Discord where we can talk about this stuff. Liking this video will help with the algorithm, and subscribing would show me that you're interested in seeing more K-pop basketball content. Any of these things I would appreciate greatly. At the very least, I'm glad you've made it to the end. Thanks for watching.